Hi there. In this tutorial I'm going to cover the techniques I use to create this scene here. So you can see we've got an electric light bulb that seems to be lit, the bulb smashes and then the filament starts to smoke and eventually melts and goes out. And we've got a little puff of smoke coming off and you can see how the smoke starts and then stops as well. So I'm going to cover all the basic elements of how I created this scene. I'm not going to go into an awful lot of detail about the modelling and the materials. I'll briefly discuss those. The main point of the tutorial really is to talk about the techniques around the initial shattering of the glass, the smoke that is coming from the filament, how to create the filament itself. I will cover that because it's actually like a little tiny spring, and then how to melt or appear to melt the filament too. If you enjoy these tutorials, don't forget to click like and subscribe. Feel free to comment or ask questions or even dislike the video. And if you don't like the video, I'd be very interested to see what the issues you spotted were so that I can improve going forward. If you're a Patreon supporter, I do upload these files for any use available to my Patreon supporters, and I upload tutorials quite regularly. So let's start the tutorial. So to begin with, I'll just model a basic bulb. I'm not going to put as much effort into it as I did for that demonstration because that obviously would take a lot longer. I'm just going to make something that we can use for the demonstration. So to begin with, we'll just put in an icosphere. I use this simply because its faces are more evenly distributed. And then we'll just increase the subdivisions a little bit. Perhaps we'll go to there, 5 subdivisions, and set it to shade smooth. I'm going to look from below and just select that central vertex, and then just Control plus to select some more, and then press O to turn on proportional editing, and then GZ to start to pull that down. I think we'll use sharp. And we'll go with that for the moment. And I'm going to press F3 and say to sphere just to get that bottom part rounded off, and then Control minus and X and delete those vertices. The rest really needs rounding off as well, but I'm not going to worry about this for this demonstration. It will be fine as it is. Scale Z0 there on the bottom just to smooth that out, and then we'll just under vertices, smooth vertices, just to round that off a little bit. And then finally, put a subdivision surface on that, just stretching that down a little bit further. I will make this thicker so that we've got both an inside and outside face, because at the moment, this only has an outside face. If I turn on face orientation, you can see it's red on the inside, blue on the outside, so that's an outer face. This is effectively inside the object, and obviously in reality this, especially when we smash it, this needs to have normals that are appropriate for an external face both on the inside and the outside. So what I'm going to do now is add a solidify modifier, and you can now see it's turned blue in the middle, and that means we've got proper normals on both sides. I'm going to apply scale, and then we'll just have a look. We don't want it very thick, obviously. So yeah, I think the default is about right there. And then we can just decide whether we want the subdivision surface above or below. Now, although you can theoretically leave that where it is in terms of just adding another ring of vertices on the bottom there just to make it a bit smoother. Although you can leave that as is and use it with those modifiers, I'm actually going to apply those modifiers. So I'll apply the solidify modifier first, which is what gave it the actual thickness. And now I'll apply the subdivision surface. So I'll just turn off that face orientation, and what we want to do now, we'll just give that a basic glass material, and that will do. So first of all, we'll make this explode. So fortunately there is a quick effect we can use. So under object, with the glass selected, we'll go to quick effects and say quick explode. So we get a number of options here, number of pieces you can shatter into, how long the shattering goes on for, what frame it's going to start on, what frame it's going to end, and how fast. And here there is a fade option to essentially make the particles fade out with time. I'm going to disable that, we don't really need that. So I'm going to say shatter on frame 25, so that's about a second in if we're doing 25 frames a second. And I want the shattering to pretty much happen instantaneously, so I'm only going to give it one frame to happen over. So frame 25, 26, it's going to shatter. If you did everything on exactly the same frame, then you'd get a completely homogeneous sphere of particles moving out, whereas by giving it an extra frame or two, some of them will happen slightly later, which will give you a more realistic, I think, explosion. Obviously, if you go for too many frames, it looks a little weird anyway. Outward velocity we'll just need to work on, but I'll put 5 for the moment and we'll see how that does. And then number of particles, I use quite a bit more than that. I think I use something like 300 or 400 particles, but we'll go with 100 for the moment. We can increase it later and I'll show you how. So if I press play now, we can see what happens, and there we go. So you can already see that's not what we necessarily want, but we can still make changes. Even though that dialog has disappeared, we come over here and click particle settings. This is essentially the settings we were playing with. Seems to have lost one there, so I'm going to put that up to 26. The lifetime is how long those particles exist for. They will vanish after that time. Typically you want them, depending on what's happening in your scene, to go on for the life of the scene. So I'm going to say 250. We'll put more particles because those were much too big, so we'll go for 300. And then we'll come down to velocity. So it's 5 meters per second at the moment, so let's go for 25 meters per second. Let's click rotation and then click dynamic rotation, and under angular velocity we'll set this to random. We'll have to play with the speed to see what we get, but let's see what that does. So you can see we're getting a better effect now, bearing in mind this is running currently at 11 frames a second. It's not being able to produce an explosion that would actually reflect how quickly it would really be playing, unless of course you wanted slow motion. But what we can do is we can, under playback, we can say frame dropping, which will mean it will drop frames to try to achieve the frame rate set up, and by default that's 25 frames a second. So I'll just click play there. See, it's still not achieving 25 frames a second. It gives you a better feel for how it would look. So at the moment, not getting much rotation on the particles, so I think they need to rotate more quickly. So let's say 5, so 10 times what it was. And now you can actually begin to see some rotation, and maybe we'll go up to 10. The actual angle at which they're rotating is random because that's what we selected here. So that's fine. And now what we'll do, there's a little bit more to do with this yet, just to add a little bit of realism. We'll add a plane, scale it up, and we'll drop it down here somewhere. Apply the scale. We'll give this a basic sort of, go for a greenish sort of look, not too much. But the important thing is I'm going to come to physics properties and I'm going to turn on collision. So that means that particles are going to bounce off this object. Depending on how many samples are being taken, some particles may pass through. What I'm also going to do on the particles, just to add a little bit more variation, is we'll click multiply mass with size. And if we come down here, we can see we can add some subframes. I'll just put one subframe in, so it will look at where the position of the particle is and do calculations on whether it's collided with anything, such as this plane, between frames, not just on the frame, which means for faster moving particles, we're more likely to achieve collisions. You can see more of them are bouncing off there. And something I advise doing once you're happy with the setup of the explosion, just have another look at that. I think that will do for this demonstration. It can be confusing when you've got overlays switched on. So I've turned those off now, and now we can just see what's going on a bit better. Some particles falling behind, some in front, and some bouncing off. So that's fine. So what it's worth doing once you're happy with it is baking it. And that just means storing it into either memory or to disk. So I turned on disk cache. It uses the default path. That's what that means. And then I said bake all dynamics, and it won't take very long unless you've got an awful lot of particles. In fact, I think I had about 700, so twice as many as this. So we now know that at frame 25, our explosion happens, our pieces of glass fly out and hit the surface and bounce off. So I'm now going to just make sure that icosphere is named and the plane, and I'm just going to hide the icosphere now. So now we'll just make a simple cylinder. I'm not going to fully model what I did before, simply because there's no need for demonstrating these techniques. I'll put 2 materials on this one. We'll make one brass, so we'll give that a sort of orangey yellow color and turn metallic all the way up, and roughness down quite a bit, and we'll make sure we give that color to viewport display as well. And then that inner piece, we'll make a new material and we'll just call it black. It's bitumen or something like that, that's sometimes in old filament bulbs, just as something I guess that they can fix everything into, and then just assign that. I'll give that a few more vertices, and then I'll add a subdivision surface to it. So we need some more there, and we'll select that inner face and just add a ring there as well. So there we go, and set it to shade smooth. I did put the little solder blob on the end as well originally. So that's the brass cup that the bulb fits into. Obviously needs to be a bit smaller, and we'll call that connector for want of a better word. And then we'll add another cylinder. We'll scale that down, scale Z. I did use some reference. I had a photo of a bulb in the background and just sort of copied that. But I think as long as you get the main features, you're not going to go far wrong. I noticed it was quite flattened as well, and there was some moulding around it as well, but again, I'm not going to do too much modelling here. Don't know that it's that interesting watching me do that. And we'll give that the glass material as well, which we'll call glass. And then we need to add a curve. So I just added a line to begin with, and then took away a couple of the vertices or segments, and then just E with the top one selected, E again, and I'm just creating this sort of hook shape very crudely, because that seems to be how they're made, just little sort of slightly bent pieces of wire. And if you need to, you can always subdivide to add some more vertices if you want to make it a little more round. That's essentially it. But it's not going to be renderable at the moment, so we also need to come down to the curve properties, make sure you've applied scale just in case you've scaled it. Then under geometry you should find bevel. We want a round bevel, and we can then just set the depth of that bevel, and we'll say fill caps as well, although it won't be that visible. Now this is obviously giant at the moment, so I'll just scale that down. Perhaps we'll go for 0.01, they're very thin little wires, and I'll extend it out a little bit with some shape. There's our basic wire, maybe slightly smaller. And then what I'm going to do is just right click it and say convert to mesh. Only really doing that just because it means I can join it to the rest of the mesh. It's not really essential to do that. So having created one of these, I'll convert it to a mesh. These are the sort of little supports for the filament. I'm going to Shift D and scale X -1. So it's just sort of opposite. And then we need 2 more wires. Just to make this quick, I'm going to select one of them, duplicate it, rotate Y 180, and then just select the vertices down the bottom here and just delete them. Select everything and just make sure that the origin is right at the bottom. It just will make it easier to manipulate. It's not perfectly straight, and that's actually fine. I don't really want this wire to be completely straight. They're usually slightly wobbly. And obviously you can do all this with it as a curve, which will make manipulating it a little bit easier. So these are the conductors that take the electricity to the filament. So as I say, I'm not going to worry too much about this. So scale X -1 on that one I've just duplicated and just put it over here somewhere. And then I'm just going to select everything and Control J just to join it all together. It's not, again, strictly necessary to do that. And I'm just going to give a new material, which we'll call steel. I'll make that quite a dark color, but quite metallic as well. In fact, fully metallic, but fairly rough, and assign that. So we're now ready for the filament. So we'll just put our 3D cursor somewhere useful, and then we'll add a curve, which is a curved spiral. We'll go for Archimedean. So it looks like just a little curved circle at the moment. It's only got one turn and the height isn't changing. So if I start to turn the height up, you can see we're now getting a spiral which doesn't get smaller or bigger, it just stays the same. And if I can now increase the number of turns, you can see what we're getting. So I'm going to turn the radius down. I'm going to need adjusting anyway. And then I'm going to turn the height down a bit there. You can start to see we're getting something that might resemble the filament of a bulb, which of course is a tiny little spiral. I think it's actually a spiral on a spiral, but I'm not going to go quite that far. We wouldn't be able to see it. We probably won't even see this. So then we can turn the number of turns up, make a reasonable length, because this is going to be smaller. So I'm just going to shrink the whole thing down now. I've got a relatively dark background at the moment because I wanted to be able to see what was going on. I think the way I'm going to do this, we'll shrink it down a bit more. And I'm essentially placing this filament in these little supports. Then I'm going to go into edit mode It's still a curve, of course. I'm just going to select this end and I'm going to put the 3D cursor just there and tell it to use the 3D cursor as the pivot point and then rotate on Z. Not going to worry about that little movement there too much. Essentially, it just needs to join up with that wire. So I just need to move my 3D cursor to there and then rotate Z. As I said, I'm doing this a little bit more roughly than I did previously. Set that back to median point. I can now remove parts of the filament that I don't need. And it's not renderable at the moment, of course, because it's just a curve. I'm just going to select that wire, just move it down so that it sort of joins to our filament. Careful not to adjust any geometry that I don't want to adjust. That will do. And now I can bevel this one as well. And then finally, what I ended up doing was just selecting a vertex halfway between the two supports, for example. Make sure proportional editing is on. I think I used sphere, and then GZ just to make the filament sag a little bit between the two supports, and then the same here. Perhaps I use smooth. But I use smooth. It just gives you the idea that it's laying in its supports. So we need to give that its own material, which will be filament. And we're actually going to have two of these materials eventually. But for the moment, we'll just set this to slightly yellow, bright emission color, and we'll set it to an emission of 5, something like that. I'm just going to reset the origin. There we go. So if I go into rendered view, you can see the filament is glowing. We bring the bulb back. This is in cycles, by the way. You theoretically could do this in EV, but I had a lot of problems with the glass materials in EV. So you can see at the moment that's a rather frosted looking glass. So if we turn the roughness down, we can get a nice clear bulb. I'm going to turn the background to black, but obviously we can't see very much there. So at this point, I'm going to select the bulb base, and then I'm going to add under lights, a 3-point light system. So they're a bit small to start with, but nevertheless, we'll work with them. Moving them out a little. And if we go to rendered view now, they're not doing very much yet because they're not very bright. So this is the backlight, so we can start to turn that up and you can see we get some illumination. Push it back a bit further. This is the fill light, so I'm going to make the light itself much bigger. Basically a very gentle light this should be, not super bright but enough to actually show up, and you get them reflected as well, which adds. And then the key light, which does need to be quite small, but is usually the brightest light of them all. So we'll turn that one up, and you can see that's the main one giving us a shadow there. And I ended up adding another light, which was an area light, quite large, partly to make sure that the smoke that we're going to produce later is well illuminated. So if I turn that down to 0, you can see it's not doing very much there, but if I put it up to 500, there we've got quite a bright light. So I think we'll go with 250, something like that. And we've got it reflected there, which is actually fine. And then just quickly adjust our camera a little bit because we're going to be doing some renders shortly. And we'll turn all the grids, etc. off. So a noisy scene at the moment, but there it is. We've got a few normals issues there, which is not unusual. And I also added a bit of anisotropic, so it sort of gives a directional sheen. So it's been polished in a particular direction. You can see lines appearing there. We'll turn the roughness up a little bit as well. I bring our bulb back. That's basically done the modeling. There is a little bit we'll need to do in a while. Looks like we need to rebake our bulb, and then we can have a look at what that looks like. So you can see we've got our pieces of glass flying around the scene. So we'll worry about the noise in the scene later. So now we're ready to move on a little, and I'm just going to hide the glass bulb so that it doesn't get in the way. So I think what we'll do at this point is do the animation of the filament breaking. So in order to do that, we're going to need to convert the filament to a mesh first of all. So I'm going to right click the filament and just say convert to mesh. And now we can select object data properties here, and we can add a shape key. Minimize that. We'll click here and we get the first shape, the basis, which of course is the starting point for the shape of this mesh. And then we'll click again and we get key 1, which is for our purposes the end point for our shape. I'm going to make it break somewhere in the middle. It doesn't have to. So I've got into edit mode, make sure no vertices are selected yet. And I'm just going to select a couple of rings of vertices somewhere around the middle. Doesn't matter if it's not that precise. And I'm going to turn on, if I didn't already have it, proportional editing here. We'll try sphere at the moment. We'll see what that looks like. So I'm now going to just press G and Z initially and just drag it down. See, I'm not happy about the way the shape is moving where it starts the curve, so we don't want rounded. Let's try sharp. GZ again. That's better. What I think I'm going to do now is I'm going to select more vertices. So we're now going to just select a group of vertices like that. So I went into wireframe so that I could select through the mesh. And we can look at some of the other options for how we select. I think smooth is probably the closest. Having dragged that down, I'm now going to scale on the X to something like that. I'm going to keep that selected. In fact, what I'm now going to do is Control plus in order to select a little more. You can see it's slowly spiraling out. And I'm going to go to my materials. I'm going to add a new material and I'm going to select filament again. Come out of edit mode for a moment with tab and just click that 3, and I'm just going to put the word broken on the end of that, and now I'm going to assign that, and we'll set the base color to black, but it doesn't really matter. The important thing is that we're going to animate setting that to transparent. So back to our shape keys. So we now have a shape key that will distort that shape like that. If we want to, we can actually make it go further by increasing this max here. If I put this up to 2, we can actually go further than I originally did. And I think I'll go to something like 1.5. We'll see how that looks once I've done it. So we want the filament to burn out and break about here. So hovering my mouse with key 1 selected over value, I'm going to press I. And I want it to break fairly quickly, but not instantly. So perhaps if 25 frames is a second, we obviously don't want it to take anything like that. Perhaps quarter of a second, something like that. So perhaps over, say, 5 or 6 frames. We'll go for 5 frames for the moment. We can always change it later. I've moved out 5 frames and I'm now going to set that value up to max and press I again. Now to begin with, that's going to be okay, but it doesn't look quite right, does it? Even ignoring the fact that there's still filament there. What I'm going to do now is right click the first of those keyframes, go to interpolation mode, and I'm going to try bounce. Let's see what that looks like. So that looks a little bit more realistic. There's a little bit of movement there. And you could try other keyframes, perhaps back. No, I think bounce is probably the best one for our purposes. And what it does is it basically goes back a little bit and then in again and back a little bit and in again. It does it quite fast though, and we've only got 5 frames there. So that will do for that. So at frame 120, our mesh melts. So what that also means is we want to change materials at that point. There's other ways of doing it, but this is how I chose to do it. So we've got a filament and a filament broken. So if we go to rendered mode now, you can see we've got our glowing filament, and both of those materials are the same right now. I'm just going to open up another window here and go to the shader editor. I've got the broken filament selected. So I want to do 2 things. I want both of these materials to stop emitting at the point at which we've decided it's broken. So it probably breaks somewhere around there, maybe just before. So we'll go for frame 122, maybe perhaps 122. We'll say the filament breaks. So obviously it can't be illuminated anymore. I'm actually going to change the base color now because it doesn't really matter. And I need to do that for both of them. I've already got that one as black. I haven't turned it completely off, and we'll add a bit of metallic to it, I think, as well, so it might have a bit of reflection. So that's the main filament, and what we want to do now is we want to come down to emission, or here it is up here. Emission strength is 5. I want this to be quite fast, so we'll go back to frame 121. We'll keyframe that, and then we'll come forward to maybe 123. Turn the emission strength down to 0 and keyframe that. So if we now let that run, you can see this part of the material essentially switches off. Might be able to see it a little better here, there. So we obviously need this part of the material to become invisible at that point because it's burnt out, it's no longer there. So I can use these little markers just to go back. So that's where, between there and there is where it breaks. So it's about here where the filament has broken, because the light is starting to fade from this area. So that's where I need to start making this one, or make this one, invisible. So make sure I've got my broken filament selected. We'll go to 1 frame before. We'll keyframe emission strength and alpha. And we're going to do this one over just 1 frame. Part of the filament is essentially evaporating. We go to the next frame, set emission strength to 0, keyframe that, and alpha to 0. And keyframe that, and you can see the filament is now invisible, but we still get a little bit of movement still going on as these melting parts cool down. If you wanted to do this really accurately, obviously you need the color to fade perhaps slightly slower and maybe go through different colors. So from that white color through to a reddish color, and you could use something like a black body node to give you the color change with temperature. But for our purposes, I think this works fine. So we've now got a point at which the filament just burns out and melts. So now we're ready to add the smoke. So obviously we want the smoke associated with the filament no longer being inside the bulb, which obviously prevents it from burning out. So I've unhidden the bulb and we'll come back here and we can see already it's around frame 25 we set it to. In fact, we set it to exactly frame 25. So I'm going to hide the bulb again. That's worth remembering, that that's where we want the smoke to begin to be emitted, because now there's air reaching the filament and obviously it's starting to oxidize, melt, and more importantly evaporate, and that's what the smoke is, or burn even. So we'll add a mesh, which is a cube, and this just needs to enclose the area that we want the smoke to be. I'll lift that cube up a little. We don't need any smoke down there. We'll go into edit mode, base select, and we'll just drag that up somewhat. Scale Shift Z, I think we'll make it a little larger. Apply the scale just in case that causes a problem. And then we'll come over to physics properties and select fluid. Change the type to domain. Let's give that cube a name, which is smoke domain. Currently on low resolution. Most of the defaults will be fine. We will make some tweaks. It's worth turning on adaptive domain, which will basically make the domain only big enough up to the maximum limit of its original size, only as big as it needs to be. So you can see this little cube down here, and that's showing us the effective resolution of the smoke. And you'll notice it's a lot bigger than our little filament. So I suspect we're not going to get any smoke at the moment. But we need to make an inflow first anyway, and this mesh is now going to be our smoke inflow. So we'll click fluid and we'll say flow. Smoke is the default, but rather than using the geometry, which would be effectively like a little puff of smoke from the filament, we want to say inflow so that it continues to produce smoke. Because it's not moving, we don't need any sampling substeps. And I turned the smoke color up to a brighter white to make it more visible. I turned off absolute density. That just allows the smoke density to vary a bit. I find it just gave a more realistic smoke for this purpose. We're going to play with the density, but we'll leave it as it is at the moment. So if I just click play, we are actually getting some smoke, but you can see it's very, very low resolution. So we'll turn that up. Ultimately, I used 256. Obviously, it takes longer to bake that. So we're going to go, I just select my domain. We'll go to 64 at the moment, still relatively low resolution. But you can see we're starting to get some shape on our smoke there, and it's clearly being emitted by the filament. I'm going to come down here and I'm going to click is resumable, which allows us to part bake it, decide whether we like it or not, and then continue if we want to. This needs to enclose the frame range that you want the smoke domain to exist. Theoretically, I don't need to start till frame 20. However, I'm going to control the smoke in a slightly different way. So if I go to frame 25 now, which is where I want the smoke to start, and then select my filament, I'm going to set the density just before frame 25, so frame 24, to 0, and keyframe that, pressed I hovering over it. Then come forward a frame, and for the moment we'll just go with 1, density of 1, and press I again. So effectively, smoke domain density goes from 0 to 1 instantly over 1 frame. I'll go back to the beginning and we'll just let that play. And you can see that's when the smoke actually starts. And that of course is just as our bulb explodes. If I go to solid view, there's the bulb exploding, there's the smoke. We might even want to go slightly later than that. I double press A there to deselect all the keyframes and then just select those 2 keyframes. Maybe I'll move them forward, just press G, just a couple of frames, so it's not instant with the explosion, it's a few frames later. There, that's probably better. Still a low resolution simulation, but there it is. And of course what we also want is the smoke to stop when our filament melts. So it's going fine now. I've probably left it too late. We can probably move this back a bit. I think that's what we'll do just for the tutorial at least. So I'm just going to grab all those keyframes there that are associated with our filament and just drag them back, perhaps to something like that. So there it is, there's the smoke being emitted. And I think I'm going to drag them even further back so we get a chance to see the smoke emitted, and then the filament melts. So somewhere around there we want the smoke to stop emitting. So just to make it easy, we'll actually go to that point. So frame 60, we'll go back one frame, frame 59, and we'll keyframe the density at 1 again there. But then we'll go to frame 60 and set the density to 0 and keyframe that. So if we now go back to the beginning, we see our smoke starting to emit, the filament melts, and then the smoke stops emitting. And if you wanted that to be a more gradual dropping off of the smoke, then you could make it that way. I think this filament has very little thermal inertia, there's not very much mass there, so it would cool down very, very fast indeed. I'm going to limit the overall length of this animation now to say 80 frames, just because there's no need to have all those frames. And I'm going to select the smoke domain, and we're going to have a look at materials. Now I didn't use the quick effects for this, so it's got no materials at all at the moment. So we'll create a new one and we'll call it smoke. We'll get rid of the principled shader. So I'm now going to add under shaders a principled volume shader, and that comes with quite a few of the settings you're going to need. Set that to full white and then drop that into volume. So let's just go to rendered view and see what we've got. So we've already got some smoke. Bear in mind this is still quite low resolution smoke. So I think what we're going to do first is we're going to render some slightly better quality smoke. I'm just going to vanish our bulb again. So we'll go up to 128, not the 256 I ended up using. You can see the little cube is smaller again, just so we started to get some shape in the smoke. And let's have a look at that. And I went with just the defaults for the smoke. That seemed to work for me. I wanted a very fine sort of smoke. So next we're going to come down here and we will just slow the smoke rising down a little bit. So basically this heat will affect how quickly the smoke rises, and although this is obviously very hot, I wanted it to be a sort of more subtle rise, so I put 0.5 there. I'm going to rise more slowly. And under vorticity you can really make it very messy with this, so I put a very small amount of vorticity on it, which just obviously makes the smoke curl and what have you more. So let's see if that's made any changes. Again, still quite low resolution, but you can see it's possibly a little bit more fluffy. I did play with using noise. That can sort of simulate a higher resolution smoke, but I ended up not using that eventually. So let's put this up now. Go to 256 so we can see it's smaller still. And we're getting more structure in the smoke now. If I stop there. And of course you can go even higher than that. So now selecting the filament, come to flow source, mesh is correct, but you'll notice we've got 1.5 on surface emission. So that means that the smoke will emit from a relatively large distance from the object. So I made that much smaller, actually put 0.25. So let's see what that's done. So you can now see we get a little bit less smoke. You can see it's not as dense, and that's because it's a smaller area that the smoke is emitting from. We have a look at that in rendered view. That's starting to look better. So that's basically the settings I used. If you want to make the smoke a little bit more visible, you can obviously put a brighter light on it, but also you can play with these numbers. So you can increase the overall density of the smoke here, but if you want more contrast in that, so I put that back down to, well, maybe we'll go for 3. What you can do is add an input, which is an attribute, and just type in there, all lowercase, density, and then we can take the color or factor out of there and just put that into density, and it's slightly lower level, but nevertheless it's still there. If I didn't have density in there, you see we don't get anything, so it's just transferred that density value over to here. And now what I can do is add a converter, which is a color ramp, and also under converters a math node. Set this to multiply, and that will basically give the overall density, and then use the color ramp, sort of cut back if I want to on the fuzzy bits at the edge. So it's quite a sharply defined smoke if you want that. Almost looks like a load of snakes. And you can just play with that. I mean, probably you need a little bit of fuzz with smoke or it doesn't look quite like smoke, but up to you what you do with that. B-spline will be the softest, and you can still use that to increase the contrast. And of course you can change the color slightly if you want to. You can go for a yellower smoke or whatever, or just for a darker smoke, but I think white is fine. And maybe that multiplier is a little too high. So if we let that run a little bit more, and render that. We'll just have a look at the render settings. I think we'll zoom the camera in a little bit just to give us a better view, and then we'll just let that run. There goes the glass, here comes the smoke, and then just as it breaks, we'll stop there, go to our output settings. So under render, I tried lots of different denoise options, and I found the best denoise was actually just to use the denoise here. So we'll cover that in a moment. But let's just go for 64 samples at the moment, which is obviously quite low, and render that. So no denoising yet. So there it is. We might want to play around with the density of that smoke, but that's essentially our render. As I say, I played with various different options under denoising, but in fact, before we go there, under light paths, we don't really need caustic, so we'll turn those off, which will reduce the render time and also reduce some of the noise. I'm going to go to slot 2, we'll put denoise on, and for this application, the best denoiser I found was to select the optics denoiser and albedo and normal. Then click advanced because you're going to be doing an animation presumably, and make sure you click this little clock, which will make sure that the seed for the noise pattern will be different for each frame, so it becomes less noticeable. So let's give that a render. So again, only doing 64 frames, and as you can see from a smoothness standpoint, that looks perfectly fine. I think part of the problem I had with noise was I was using vector blur, but we'll get into that in a minute. So there's slot 1 with no denoise, and there's slot 2. So even at 64 samples, that's pretty acceptable. So let's go back a few frames, give that a render. I'm making this one happen much quicker than I did in my other one, of course. And then we'll go to the compositor. So there's just a few things to do for this. We'll click use nodes, and we'll come over to here, and we're going to turn on vector. I think at this point we're going to re-render the scene, but we're going to go to a point at which there's lots of movement in the scene. So here, where we've got an explosion going on, we'll render that. There's no smoke in this bit, but there is a lot of moving fragments of glass. So you can see it's a perfectly captured, unblurred image at the moment, which you'd need a nice high-speed camera to do. So to make that a little more realistic, we're going to add some blur to that. But before we do, let's just add a filter, which is a glare filter. You can just drop it straight in there. I set it to fog glow, left it on medium. I set the threshold to about 5 and the mix at 1. So now all you're getting is the glowing bits. Looks like the filament is slightly covered by glass at the moment. So I'm going to just turn the threshold down to 3. There we can just see the filament starting to come through. But it just gives us a little bit of glow, and I put the size up slightly so that when we see the filament fully, there's a nice glow around it. But obviously we can't see anything else at the moment, and there's a reason for that. So we'll now go up to color, mix, and we'll set this to an add node, and I'll put my original image in the top. So that's now adding the fog glow on top, which allows me to essentially dim the glow without changing its parameters. And I use quite a low value, but the exact value you use will depend on how your scene turns out. We use 0.25 for now. So that's my initial scene, and now I want to add some vector blur. So go to add, under filter, select vector blur, and we'll drop that in there. You can see it's now having a think down here. In order to make this work though, or work properly, we will need to add some more parameters in. You can see it's finished processing and it's really done nothing to the scene. And that's why I turned on vector here. We've got a depth output here. Basically, to calculate the vector blur, needs to know how close it is to the camera, a moving object, because obviously a fast moving object will appear to move faster when it's close than when it's further away. So take the depth output and put that into the Z input. Move that out the way. And then take the vector output, which also tells Blender how fast an object is moving, and put that into the speed input. And then we'll wait. And obviously this calculation takes a while. And there you go. You can see we've got some quite interesting effects there. And you can play around with how extreme it is and so on. So I just accepted the defaults, but you could set a min and a max. You can have more samples to have a higher quality of blur, and you can reduce the amount of the blur. So if I set that to 0.5, for example, you can see it's not so extreme now. I think maybe 0.75. So one last note, I'm not going to go through the whole setting up of an animation, but essentially we've got most of it here now. But one thing I did find useful, because with all this vector blurring and denoising, frames can take a little while. So this frame is taking something like 18 seconds to render, which doesn't sound long, and certainly this is only 80 frames, but if you had a longer animation it would just take a lot longer obviously to render, because each frame is taking quite a while. So under performance, I actually turned off use tiling so that effectively it does essentially what it wants to do. So that was 17.6 seconds. We'll give that another render. This probably won't make much of a difference to it. If you use tiling, you can actually set a tile size which is optimal for your graphics card. It used to be that 512 seemed to be optimal, but that seems to be less significant with the later versions of Blender. That's actually slower. That's actually 21 seconds. So you can try this before and after sort of setting and see which one works for you. That may actually be just because it didn't calculate it all last time because of the way I was making changes. I also used spatial splits, and essentially this will actually potentially slow down a single render, as will the next setting, which is persistent data. So if we render it now, we had just over 21 seconds there. We may find we actually get a slower render, but this is one of those things where you just need to realize what it's doing, which is that Blender is holding on to a lot of the data it created to describe the shapes of things, and if they haven't changed, it uses them again in the next frame rather than recalculating them. So that one actually was slightly better, but you can find that persistent data can cause it to be a little slow for one frame. But when you render a sequence of frames, you'll find the next frame is actually quicker, and that's because it's kept the data. So I recommend using that setting for an animation, as long as you haven't got any memory problems. You can see this one used 3 GB of VRAM, and I've got 4 available, so it was fine. But if you're running out of memory, persistent data may be an issue. And that's really all there is to this. I will upload the original file for my Patreon supporters. If you enjoy these tutorials, don't forget to click like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next tutorial. Thanks a lot.